Okay, thanks a lot for having me. My name is Marshall Burke. I am on the faculty at Stanford University, and I wanted to say thanks to Jen for organizing this great session. So today I want to talk about COVID and the environment, what some things we have learned about the environment more broadly, the environment effects on human outcomes, our ability as humans to shape environmental outcomes, what we've learned from the COVID epidemic, and many things we still need to learn. Okay, so why talk about this at all? We're in the midst of a global pandemic. It seems on some level ridiculous to be talking about the environment or links to the environment. So why should you care? Um, First reason you should care is that changes in the environment. We have some evidence that these and particular changes related to air pollution could actually impact the trajectory of the COVID epidemic. So I'll show you some evidence that that's the case. Um, for folks who live on the West Coast, this has been one of the worst air quality years on record. So this was a beautiful midday San Francisco in early September, thanks to the wildfires that were burning throughout the state. So this is something that was very important in our recent history. Very large scale exposure to air pollution. And one thing we want to understand that given that we were in the midst of a respiratory epidemic, did this actually worsen outcomes in that epidemic? And what does that mean potentially for other infectious disease or future COVID trajectory? There was a nice article in the Stanford Daily, which is the student paper at Stanford, on this satire during the fire. So Stanford students could just save money on Juul vaping by just walking outside amid the wildfires, sort of a more of a joke about the crazy amounts of smoke that we had experienced. Okay, so who cares? Number one is this link to air pollution. Again, I'll show you some evidence on that. Who cares? Number two is that the action that we took to try to get the epidemic under control, in particular the action that we took earlier in the year in the spring and early summer, actually reduced air pollution pretty substantially. We saw this first in China and then in much of Europe and then later in the US. And this necessary action that we took to stop the spread of the disease probably had a huge hidden benefit in terms of health. We know that air pollution is overall bad for health, whether or not we're in a pandemic. And so improvements in air quality likely had health benefits. I'll show you some work to try to quantify those benefits. And finally, I think the COVID response that we've seen probably has important lessons for our climate response in ways that we should think about, and the harms that COVID has wrought, both on our economy and on our individual health, are actually not that dissimilar from some of the harms we might expect from unmitigated climate change over the next 2 decades. And I think those are very, very worth bearing in mind. Okay, let's start with air pollution, number one. And I want to take you through a couple of important methods points when we think about the relationship between air pollution and COVID, and particularly when we think about the question, does exposure to air pollution, either from wildfires or to longer run exposure to air pollution from other anthropogenic sources, could this worsen COVID-related outcomes or outcomes from other infectious disease? So here's hypothesis number one, and this actually has gotten a lot of attention in the media. Hypothesis number one is that long-term exposure to dirty air, so just living in a place where you are chronically exposed to bad air pollution, that leads to worse health outcomes overall. It leads you to be more susceptible to overall infection. And this could lead then to worse outcomes in the COVID epidemic if you are infected. So this is, I think, a very plausible hypothesis with a lot of, at least intuitive support for some of these linkages. It turns out it's a very tricky question to evaluate empirically. So here again is the story. You're exposed to pollution over the long run. This affects your overall health, and then that in turn translates into worsened COVID outcomes if in fact you are infected. So why is that tricky to evaluate? It turns out there are many unobserved factors, confounders, that are correlated with both long-term exposure to pollution that also affect your overall health, that also might independently affect COVID outcomes. So here on the right, I'm showing you a plot of what air pollution, what Americans experience with long-term air pollution, and you can see it has a very strong spatial pattern. Out where I live in California, the Central Valley and Southern California has the worst air quality. But really, a lot of the bad air is sort of throughout the Midwest in the U.S. and in the South. And many other patterns also look like this. Income gradients across the US are correlated with average air pollution, right? And we think that income or economic status could affect your overall health, could affect COVID outcomes, and it's associated with long run air pollution. So it's really hard to think about good ways to separate those things out. So the existing studies that do this, and studies that when they came out in April and May got a lot of attention, many are still working papers. What they do is they try to just control for all this other stuff. They try to think of all the confounders that we can, socioeconomic, demographic confounders, and control for them in a statistical analysis. And when they do that, they find things like 1 microgram increase in PM 2.5 over the long run. So 1 microgram difference in long run PM 2.5 exposure is associated with a 10 to 15% differential in outcomes, and particularly mortality from COVID. And there's a couple papers in the US and EU that seem to say this. So how should we think about those numbers? As someone who thinks hard about causal inference in these sorts of settings, I think these studies are doing as good of a job as they can in trying to control for these confounders. But I think you're always going to be worried that there's some confound that we haven't thought of or haven't measured well that's not necessarily well controlled for in these regressions. So we could think of these as associations, but not necessarily as causal effects. Okay, here's a hypothesis, number 2. So instead of thinking about long-run exposure, we're instead thinking about short-run exposure. So hypothesis is that short-term exposure to dirty air worsens your health outcomes. We have a lot of evidence that that's the case. That might worsen, again, your susceptibility to overall infection, worsens your immune function. Again, we have evidence for that. And that could, again, worsen outcomes in the COVID epidemic. This is also tricky empirically. So again, here's the sort of line of reasoning. You have short-run exposure to pollution. This affects your overall health, and then this affects your susceptibility to infection or your outcomes conditional on being infected. So why is this tricky? Well, during the COVID shutdown, what we saw was that we had economic shutdowns to deal with the virus. The whole point of these was that they would affect the trajectory of the epidemic, and they did. But they also affected short-run pollution exposure. When we shut down our economy, we reduced the amount of pollution that's in the air. Here's some evidence of that. China, this was sort of most stark in China. Here's a great paper that came out a couple months ago by Gu Jinhee at University of Hong Kong and co-authors. Basically what the dots show here, the lockdown is shown here in the orange, and the dots show the evolution of PM 2.5 across urban areas, and particularly areas in China where the lockdown was strongest. And what you see is really dramatic declines in key pollutants. So again, this is for PM 2.5, and these are in micrograms. And so these are, very, very substantial, 15, 20% reductions in PM 2.5 on a weekly timescale, right? So again, you have these economic shutdowns. They affect air pollution, but they also affect the outcome. So if you're trying then to study the effect of air pollution on the outcome, you're still worried about these compounds. So what do we need here to actually study this? We need something else, something other than these economic shutdowns that pushes around air pollution, right? That leads to more plausibly random variation in air pollution. And here I think we have a better shot because there are lots of other things that we can think about that cause pollution to vary in the short run somewhat randomly. So wildfires is one that we're working on in our group. Again, given the recent California experience, there were actually huge dust plumes from Africa that blew across the Atlantic and into population centers throughout the US that generated pretty random variation in PM during the epidemic. Winds blow stuff around, and there are other policy changes sort of separate from the shutdowns that could also matter. So there's a couple papers, again, looking at this. These are preprints, working papers. But they find, I think, pretty consistent evidence that short-term increases in PM increased hugely both COVID infections and COVID deaths in the US and in Germany. So here are the citations. Again, these are working papers, but they use research designs that I think are more capable of plausibly isolating variation in pollution from all the other things that might also affect COVID-related outcomes, right? There's other nice papers for other infectious disease, so particularly thinking about influenza that I think provides complementary evidence. And again, in our group, we're working on the wildfires link. That's not sort of ready for prime time yet, so I'll just leave it with the ... there. Okay, but overall, I think, COVID or no, we have very strong evidence that exposure to dirty air is bad. If this is what it looks like outside at noon, you should stay inside, as I think people mostly understand now. Okay, so part number 2, did shutdowns have an unexpected benefit through an environmental channel? So again, here's the plot on the left that I just showed you about changes in air pollution in China. Early on in March and April, folks started looking at the satellite images closely on this, and they were pretty dramatic. So here on the right is satellite-based estimates of near ground NO2 density over China. Chinese shutdowns really started in February, and you saw dramatic reductions in NO2 between January, even late January and early February, as can be seen in these 2 plots. Okay, so we saw short-term improvements in air quality, and not thinking about a COVID environment, but just thinking about pollution more broadly. We have literally hundreds of papers that tell us that exposure to air pollution in the short term can make us really sick and can increase mortality. And so let's think about that in China then. Let's take this really dramatic short-term reduction in pollution and think about what were the additional, or what might have been the additional health benefits from this air pollution exposure. So it turns out there was a really nice analogous historical, what we would call a natural experiment. This was in the Beijing Olympics in 2008. So around the Olympics, and so they were in summer 2008, the government was quite worried and was facing a lot of public outcry about the very poor air quality in Beijing, and the worry that all these top athletes from around the world were going to have to breathe in dirty air as they competed in the Olympics. So what the government did was, in the month prior, basically to the Olympics, they forced local factories in the surrounding area to close. They kept cars off the road, and this resulted, again, in a pretty dramatic drop in key pollutants for the few months surrounding the Beijing Olympics. And these drops were actually surprisingly close to what we just saw in the COVID lockdown. So 20, 30, up to 50% drop in some of these key pollutants. Again, just for a few months, right, while the Olympics were going on. So the same authors as the study I just showed you wrote a very nice paper back in 2016 that used these changes, these few months changes, to estimate the impacts of, again, large short-run changes in air pollution on mortality among Chinese populations, right? And what they found was, consistent with a lot of other evidence, if you improve air quality, or conversely, if air quality worsens, who's most affected? It's the young. So these are people who are 0 to 4 on this plot in the lower right, and it's the older populations who tend to be most effective. And so they were able to estimate plausibly causal effects of air pollution on mortality across the Chinese population. Okay, so while we cannot observe the effect of pollution necessarily in real time, we don't have the data, we can use these 2 facts to infer what were the likely benefits of these air quality improvements in China. We know how much the air quality improved, and given this historical experience, we have a sense of what the likely mortality response could have been. Okay, and so we do a back of the envelope here, and I'm putting the citation down here. We haven't published this. I literally just blogged this out back in the spring. It got a lot of attention, for better or worse, but again, it's based on 2 numbers we actually know pretty well. So again, lockdowns led to a pretty dramatic improvement in PM 2.5 for about 2 to 3 months in China. That pollution has come back up as their economy has recovered. And we calculate based on that dose response function I showed you that this likely saved 50,000 elderly and infant lives throughout China. That's a huge number. Compare that to the roughly 5,000 reported COVID deaths in China. So this would suggest that the benefits, the health pollution, the health impacts that were very bad during COVID were actually much smaller than the benefits from the air pollution reduction. Now, I should emphasize this is again a projection. This is not a measurement. We can't make this measurement in real time. And the actual measurement is going to be very tricky because this was in the midst of a pandemic that was causing a lot of harm otherwise. But it's very important to keep these sort of scales in mind and potentially the very large benefits of cleaning up dirty air in the short run. Okay, so what did we see in the US? In the US, we saw smaller but also substantial air quality benefits. This was from a nice paper citation here at the bottom that just came out recently, last couple months. So they looked at a range of pollutants using ground monitors and saw, again, pretty large declines in NO2 across the board, either whether you were in a county that totally shut down early or shut down later on. And they attribute this mainly to changes in traffic density, which declined remarkably. For PM 2.5, which is really one of the main things we care about when we think of human health impacts. There, the declines were really concentrated, in regions that shut down early. So in those places, we saw a 10 to 15% decline, mainly in urban areas that shut down early. So this is mainly East Coast, West Coast areas. 10 to 15% decline in PM 2.5. Basically no movement in counties that closed down later. And this was attributable to PM 2.5, not just coming from traffic, but coming from a range of other sources, sometimes natural sources that just aren't going to vary as much with these business closures. But anyway, across the board, pretty substantial air quality benefits. And of course, air pollution was not the only thing that was changing. There's been a lot of attention to reductions in CO2 emissions during this period. So here are two plots from a nice paper led by Noah Diffenbaugh that was a review paper and with a bunch of authors, including me. Noah did all the work. So here's the estimates of the daily evolution of CO2 emissions across different countries. You see Chinese CO2 emissions were down, over 20%. US emissions were down, at least for a period, over 30% estimate. And cumulatively, the estimates now are that in places like the US, we're going to see in 2020 roughly a 10% decline in CO2. And that's a lot, right? And on the face of it, this seems good, right? We want the world to emit less CO2. But of course, these reductions in CO2 were associated with huge increases in things that we don't want. So here is a plot of the unemployment rate in the US back to 2005. So you can see the Great Recession that caused immense economic harm and suffering throughout this country and around the world. Unemployment peaked in the Great Recession at about 10%. And as most folks will know, during the pandemic, it peaked much higher than that, right? In April 2020, it was up to about 15% in the US. The economy has now recovered to some extent, but unemployment is still at about 7%, 6.5%, which is quite high, right? And again, near the peak of the Great Recession before. Okay, so let's think about then what was the implied elasticity. Elasticity is a percentage change per percentage change that we got. So basically, for every and this is just in back of the envelope math for 2020, for every 2 to 3% decline in CO2, we got about a 1% increase in unemployment. And about the same thing on the air pollution side. For every 2 to 3% decline in PM 2.5 in 2020 that we got about a 1% increase in unemployment. And those are not good ratios, right? A 1% increase in unemployment is really bad. A almost 10% increase is really catastrophic from a human perspective, from a human suffering perspective, right? And the other problem is that the roughly 10% reduction in CO2 that we saw is roughly what we need every single year if we want to keep warming below 1.5 C, right? So this is a target that's going to be increasingly hard to hit. We have to have dramatic near-term consistent annual reductions in CO2. that look almost like what we got during the COVID shutdown in 2020. And that's terrible, right? Look at the immense economic suffering that happened as a result of these shutdowns, right? So is mitigation really this hard? Is the conclusion that we should draw is that mitigation is really this hard? Like, look how hard we had to try to get a 10% reduction. Look at all the economic suffering. Is this what mitigation looks like? So let's think about that in terms of the effectiveness of this style of mitigation, of shutting down our economy. So here's some estimates of the cost per ton of CO2 reduced. And this is a really important parameter when we think about mitigation investments. So the Rhodium Group put out an estimate that suggested, in terms of the cost per ton of CO2 reduced, COVID-related shutdowns cost something like $4,000 to $5,000 per ton of CO2 reduced. That's basically the amount we had to spend to get that amount of CO2 reduction. Okay, those are very high costs. Here's some other estimate of costs for other things that we know how to do. So onshore wind can reduce its cost of CO2 reduction per ton of CO2 reduced is $24. So this is from a nice paper by Gillingham and Stock that reviewed a lot of this evidence. Utility scale solar is on the same order of magnitude, $28 per ton. Some really nice recent analysis from Giving Green, I would point you to their very nice website, suggested that other, in terms of CO2 equivalent, things like refrigerant destruction is actually even more cost effective, so maybe $15 per ton. And even fairly fabulously expensive direct carbon capture from the air technologies, which right now are still pretty expensive, $1,000 per ton, are still more cost effective than the way in which we got CO2 reductions during the COVID epidemic, right? So how we went about CO2 reductions during COVID, again, that wasn't the point of the economic shutdowns that we had. It's a terrible way to mitigate, right? And we already have much better ways to mitigate, and it doesn't have to be this hard. So what else can we learn then? So if this was a bad way to mitigate, we don't want to mitigate that way. So that's not the environmental or mitigation lesson we should take. What else could we learn? So the other thing I want to think about is the amazing progress we've seen in the last 12 months to develop a vaccine, right? So as been covered widely in the popular press, right, we have seen literally unprecedented progress in speed in developing a COVID vaccine. So for many other infectious disease, we still do not have a vaccine. So here's Zika at the top, we don't have one. AIDS, we don't have one. Some of the more recent infectious diseases, we don't have one. Malaria, although there's some new promising evidence that we might have one soon, we still don't have one. And many of these diseases have been around for half a century, many centuries, and yet we still don't have a vaccine. Compare that to the coronavirus, right? Given massive public and private investment in developing a vaccine, we have what look like two, and here I'm speaking in mid-November 2020, right? It looks like we have two fairly effective, or actually extremely effective vaccines that we've developed in less than 12 months, right? Just totally remarkable. Okay, so you might say, okay, yeah, fine. We did that with COVID. What's the climate analogy here, right? COVID is fundamentally different. We have hundreds of thousands of people dying in this country and around the world. It's just a fundamentally different problem and a different motivation than in climate. Okay, I actually think that's not true. So let's actually think about the numbers here. And I'm going to argue that COVID and climate actually provide pretty similar motivation for making these large-scale investments in technologies that mitigate the problem. COVID, it's vaccine. For climate, it's the range of technologies and policies that we're going to need to fight climate change. Okay, so let's think about this both in terms of health, in terms of economic outcomes. So right now, if we look at the total deaths that we've seen from COVID around the world, we have a mortality rate of something like 18 per 100,000. That's a global mortality rate. Of course, that differs somewhat by country. Okay, 18 per 100,000. So what do we think climate change is going to bring? So I think the best paper by this is by Tamil Carlton and co-authors, still a working paper, it's available online. Their estimates, using sort of the best empirical evidence we have, is that by mid-century, under sort of RCP 8.5, so pretty high warming scenario, we could see something like COVID rates of mortality every single year. So again, by 2050, we should expect 20 deaths per 100,000 from climate change, right? And this is mainly from temperature-related warming around the world. So again, 2050, we're going to see annual COVID-like mortality every single year from climate change. And by end of century, this is maybe 4 times higher. Again, this is an unmitigated, this is a world that's warmed up 4 degrees Celsius, right? But these are huge numbers. These are much larger than COVID, right? So COVID, if anything, is just setting us up, getting us used to the kind of mortality that we might see under climate change, again, if we don't mitigate, right? So in terms of health impacts, these are very similar. All right, let's think about economic impact. So what's the COVID cost to GDP? We actually won't know this very well for a while. Our real-time estimates suggest, depending on where you are in the world, 5 to 10% reductions in GDP, at least in the short run. We don't know what the recovery is going to look like. Often recoveries take much longer than we expect. We'll have to see, but let's call it 10% right now. Okay. Our work suggests that globally, the projected cost to GDP from climate change is going to be larger than that by end of century. 20% annual losses to GDP compared to a world without climate change, right? This is from a set of papers I've done with co-authors over the last few years, right? So again, the economic effects of COVID are actually quite similar to what we're going to expect by mid-century or end of century from climate change, right? So these things are not dissimilar. So what does that mean? To me, it means if we can make these investments in COVID, we need to recognize the similarity and we need some comparable Operation Warp Speed for climate change, right? We need the public and private investments that we've had for COVID, and we need them for climate change. And what the COVID experience shows us is that when we make these investments and when people are motivated to generate these changes, we can do it, right? We can invent the new technologies and approaches that we need. So in some sense, that makes me very hopeful, right? And I think that's a very positive lesson coming out of COVID. Okay, so to wrap up, what are the big lessons here? So number one, I think there's sort of emerging evidence that environmental changes, particularly on the pollution side, might have exacerbated the COVID epidemic. I think there's still a lot more to learn here. Number two, the COVID pandemic, and in particular, our societal response to the pandemic, created very large environmental changes, CO2, pollutants. To me, these are best viewed as an additional benefit of the necessary action that we took, but they are not good approaches to generating these changes, right? So these are, third bullet point here, a terrible blueprint, a terrible economic blueprint for how to improve environmental outcomes. It's an incredibly costly way to do that. Let's not do it that way. But as I just said, to me, the flip side is and particularly with the vaccine development, these are a promising blueprint for how quickly we can move on underlying technological improvements and solutions when we choose to do so. So that's the sort of hopeful message that I take home from the COVID epidemic. Okay, thanks a lot. I look forward to the live discussion later on in AGU.